podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
FanDuel presents Sunday Victories. When you get great reception at your distant cousin Todd's not-so-great wedding reception, and you watch the game on your phone without getting busted. You bet, and you won in the game of life, my friend. Now, if you want to bet on the game of football, try FanDuel.
21 plus and present in Virginia. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis Podcast with me, James Gray, of the iNewspaper and 9news.co.uk. As always, I've got George Bellshaw with me, phoning in from another part of London, and we've got Calvin Betton, who is away in Italy on assignment, so we apologise in advance for any delay on the line or any sound quality issues. Calling Calvin, how are you? Buonasera.
I don't know. See.
Superb. The consummate linguist. Are you all right? Tell me, how is Italy?
Yeah, it's okay. I got here today, and the hotel is basic, and the venue is basic. I asked the lady if I could get takeaway, and she said you can get a pizza, but only a margarita. And I said, "Is it a good margarita?" And she said, "No." So that was my options for dinner.
Living the dream, I believe.
And I can confirm it wasn't very good. Yeah.
George, talk to me about your culinary options this evening.
I'm currently sort of slyly eating a ramen that my girlfriend's kindly made. It was a caramelized onion ramen from Mira Soda recipe.
So in America, like, ramen is what students eat. Like, it's like pot noodle, right? Like it's just sort of like a byword for cheap, easy food. But here it's become like sort of gourmet Eastern food. I had a frozen lasagna, homemade, admittedly, and then frozen and then reheated. So, and actually,
I kind of feel like I'm winning tonight. Really,
close.
Normally about myself.
Close.
Ellen has worked very hard on this, so I would have to back her corner quite hard, probably.
I mean, my partner also worked very hard on lasagna, which I then came home from a stag do and didn't want to eat absolutely anything and refused to eat it, so she had to freeze it. So I also feel, well, we might have to have a fight. We'll have a taste test, George. There you go. We'll have some sort of MasterChef. We put our partners up against each other. I'll stop waffling on because we've got loads of tennis to talk about, and there's a development in the football because Wales have a penalty, but that's football, and I'm sure if you're in any country that has a team in the World Cup at the moment, you're hearing more than enough about that. We're going to talk about Novak Djokovic because he's won the ATP Finals again. We'll assess quite what that means for his legacy and what we think of his year overall. Casper Ruud, of course, made the final, and we'll talk about how stealthily he has been working his way up the game over the last 2 seasons to really be one of the most consistent players on tour. We'll talk about a tremendous row between Stefanos Tsitsipas and Andrey Rublev, and we'll also talk a bit about gambling in tennis after some quite serious revelations in The Guardian this week. But there is only one place and one man with whom we can start. It is Novak Djokovic. He ruled the roost at the ATP Finals. He was unbeaten in his 5 matches. He dropped just 1 set, and that was to Daniil Medvedev in a very odd match, I should say. He beat Casper Ruud 7-5, 6-3 in the final. He would practically be world number 1 again were there points for Wimbledon. I think he would have exactly the same number as Carlos Alcaraz if Wimbledon had counted. He's the oldest man to win the ATP Finals at the age of 35 and 5 months, and he's now equalled Roger Federer on 6 titles. George, is there any chance that he doesn't surpass Roger and pick up yet another of the great man's records?
Sorry, what was the record you just said? I completely missed that.
It's Roger Federer's record of 6 ATP
Finals. Oh, of the ATP
Finals.
Sorry, excuse me. Sorry. I thought you said Australian Opens. I thought he was already past that. No, I think it's possible he doesn't win it. I mean, he seems to have been not as engaged at this tournament for a while. I think the one thing you'd say about Novak's season this season is most things he's played since the clay, he's been very, very engaged in, and it's kind of felt like, well, because he's not had so many big events this year, and he's got so good at peaking at top events that maybe he's had a little more mental energy to spare, perhaps. I think in previous years he might not have turned up as serious as this. I'm not saying this isn't a big event, but it's just it hasn't seemed like a top motivation for him over the last few years. But yeah, I mean, look, he's had a pretty incredible year. Again, we've said this a few times the last few weeks. He's had a pretty incredible year considering the events he's missed and what he's still achieved this season. And, for him to win this unbeaten, pull level on Alcaraz, if you count the Wimbledon points, which I know is still a technicality, but given he couldn't play the US and Australian Open, to miss 4,000 points off them plus 2,000 off Wimbledon, which he definitely did win, I still believe he would have won the Australian Open had he been able to go and win that. I still just can't look past this guy's total world number one. And I don't think he actually played that well this week. Like, I watched a lot of his matches and he kind of was going through the motions. He was complaining a little bit, being ill at times. But he just has that ability to raise his level. And that was the case in the final against Ruud. First set, really not quite engaged. But kind of the midway through the second set, after having pinched the first, he can just turn it on to such a degree that no one else really can. And his lower level is still so good. But when he hits those heights, I still think he's just comfortably the best player in the world. And yeah, he's my guy to beat next year. I've said it time and time again. I still think it's very possible he can go and win 4 slams next year.
It's funny you say that, George, because actually I posted something on Twitter after he won it and said that there really isn't a more deserving champion of tennis in 2022 because he has, whenever he's played, he's dominated it. And as you say, that is remarkable for someone who couldn't play 2 of the Grand Slam tournaments. And lots of people were saying, well, what kind of indictment is this of the generation around him? And I kind of struggle. Like, Calvin, you always talk about Djokovic as the greatest match player of all time. And I do wonder whether that means that as he gets older, his slowdown will be slower, if that makes any sense. He will not be diminished so much by age because he has such an advantage in his mental and tactical game.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, but he also his 2 greatest assets are his match playability and his movement, and it will affect his movement. You can't be moving at 38 like you did when you were 24. That's impossible. So, on one side, yeah, one of his greatest assets is match play and his brain, and he won't lose that, but he will lose some athleticism, I would think. I was just wondering there when you said, is there any chance that he doesn't pass Federer? I mean, there's a good chance he does, but I don't think it's far from guaranteed. The ATP Finals, as a rule, has some weird results anyway, has some strange winners. And he's, as George said, he's never entirely committed to it some of the times. But the main thing, I think, even throughout this whole indoor season, he's really benefited from, and no one's mentioned it, he really benefited from Zverev not being around. Because in 3 sets, in best of 3, especially on indoors, Zverev has really had his number in the last couple of years. And he's the one player who I think he probably still fancies himself in best of 5 outdoors on slow hard courts. But I think in best of 3 on anything other than grass, I don't think he fancies Zverev at all.
I think best of 3 as a whole, as a format for Novak, is going to be increasingly a problem. I think players will get the better of him, not just Zverev, and we're seeing that more and more. Even Auger-Aliassime can kind of get there. We said this time and time again. I just think he'll have a hold still on best of 5 from this ability to manage matches, and the best of 5 just buys him time, buys him that experience, buys him that ability to dip in and out and almost kind of conserve his energy. And that is harder to do, as Calvin says, like against a guy like Zverev, where on an indoor hard court where he can get at you with his big serve, big forehand, keep on top of you. So yeah, it is definitely not a guarantee, but kind of on the movement point, I mean, you do just watch this guy sometimes at the 35 and think, bloody hell, it is exceptional. I've genuinely not seen a 35-year-old in any sport move like Djokovic is moving now. And I'm not saying he's moving as quickly, but it's that combination of anticipation, still that remarkable flexibility, and he's still pretty bloody quick as well. I mean, he is a super, super, super athlete. Federer in his later years, I think we all kind of accepted there was a little bit of adaptation, and a lot of it was still built on, he was anticipating things, but Federer would leave a lot of shots. I kind of felt, he would accept points he wasn't going to win. He kept he has that ability to quick strike tennis. Djokovic is still playing pretty similarly in the way we say Murray kind of can't play now. And I know Murray's been through a lot more kind of physically exerting surgeries or whatever. But I still think either way, Djokovic, the way he's playing now is pretty darn incredible at 35.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said there, George, that you don't think you've seen it at 35 in any other sport. LeBron James is 37, and anybody who watches NBA will tell you that he hasn't lost any of his athleticism, which is freakish. In fact, he's probably, over the last 3 or 4 years, he's probably got bigger and stronger and maintained the speed that he always had. And Tom Brady, to be fair, was still winning Super Bowls at 41.
I think the difference for me, and I probably could have said this a little bit clearer, is I think actually sports where you're adding muscle and power, it's still okay to do it at 37. I think it's the dexterity of Djokovic that amazes me, that complete flexibility, the kind of side to side movement that I've not really seen. And I know he's kind of pushed the boundaries anyway, regardless of what age he is, in terms of that unique flexibility, ability to kind of go side to side, but to still be able to do that, for me, I kind of freak out slightly that when he kind of goes over his ankles still at 35, for example, it's pretty mad stuff to think he's just not going to snap at some point.
I think, and what you're kind of alluding to there, George, the most remarkable thing is that his strengths often are still young man things. I talked about the mental game and the tactical game, but yeah, the flexibility is something that you associate specifically with younger players. It's something that you lose, that we all lose as time goes on, as we get older and frankly less fit. So that definitely makes it more remarkable. I think it's also, and you mentioned Murray there, it's kind of brought into sharp focus by what Murray and Federer and Nadal have been through, kind of in a similar age bracket. And I know Murray's actually a bit younger than him, but because of what they went through in terms of physical slowdown and injury and, slower recovery from injury, I think it brings it into sharper focus exactly what Novak is doing and quite how impressive it is that he has avoided injury. And I actually think, to be fair, he's also had some quite convenient breaks from the game. I don't know whether he would have won, and this is massive hypothetical, but I don't know whether he would have won the ATP World Tour Finals had he not had a month and a half off in the middle of the season. It's what we always talk about the ATP World Tour Finals, is they throw up weird results because they're right at the end of the season and players are hanging out their backside. And, so Grigor Dimitrov wins it sometimes, and, Tsitsipas has won it, and Zverev has won it, and Medvedev has won it, and there's no real consistency to who goes out and wins it. So, and I think Djokovic, he would probably say it himself that in some ways that mental break as well as a physical break, we all know how much Australia kind of put him through the ringer, and he's talked about that. And I do think that's been a bit of an advantage. Speaking of physical decay, Rafa Nadal had a very poor week where he lost his first 2 matches in straight sets to Taylor Fritz and Felix Auger-Aliassime. He then gritted his way to a win over Casper Ruud, which was actually quite impressive. George, how much, if anything, do we read into Rafa Nadal's performances this week?
I mean, it's hard to say for a number of reasons. I mean, before that final win, he was on a 4-match losing streak, which I think I'm right in saying has only happened twice in his career at ATP.
He hasn't won 30. He hasn't lost 4 matches in a row for 13 years.
Yeah, so this isn't something that happens particularly often. I wouldn't necessarily say it's panic stations for Nadal. I don't think indoor hard suits him as much as the other surfaces. We've said that before. Okay, we've kind of given him the caveat over the years of, okay, he's just not been fit around this time of year, but his results as well do kind of speak to the fact that this isn't his strongest surface. There is the kind of factor of how match fit he is, how sharp he is. I still think there's something to be said for actually getting a few matches under his belt at the end of the season, but we can't escape this, and we've said this for years and years and years and years about Nadal, that there will be a point where he inevitably does decline, and I can't say with certainty this will be the time, because every other time it's been the case that he suddenly bounces back, and the guy has still won 2 Grand Slams this year, but the second half of the season's not been where he'd have liked it to be. We know he had a lot of physical issues at the French Open. If you take the last 6 months in isolation, you're back in that stage where you're like, oh, crikey, I'm a bit worried about Nadal. And throwing the fact he's now become a father, you don't know how that's going to change the mentality, those kind of wider life points. You have to start thinking, let's put it this way, he's not going to win the Australian Open this year. I'd put a lot of money on that if Novak is 100% going, which I believe we've had confirmed now. He comes in for me as like 4th, 5th favourite at best for that. And I wouldn't back him against Novak on a hard court for the rest of his career, frankly.
Yes, I did mean to mention that in the news section at the top, actually. Novak Djokovic will be at the Australian Open after his visa ban, which was automatically applied, having been deported. That was overturned by the new government in Australia. Craig Tiley had said, I know Novak wants to come play and get back competing. It's where he's had the best success, and he will in fact be back in Australia after that decision was overturned. And George, I'm not sure many people will take you up on your bet that Rafael Nadal won't win the Australian Open if he is there. I want to read you what Nadal said. I think it was after the first defeat, which was obviously the first match back. He said, I don't think I forget how to play tennis, how to be strong enough mentally. I just need to recover these positive feelings and all this confidence and this strong mentality that I need to be at the level I want to be. And I don't know if I'm going to reach that level again, but what I don't have any doubt that I'm going to die for it. A pretty strong word, to say the least, Calvin. I wonder if maybe this is just how Nadal sort of talks publicly, that he says, oh, I don't know if I'm going to do it, but I'm going to try. To me, that sounded a little bit different from what we're used to from him.
Maybe up until a couple of years ago, but then, even going into the Australian Open this year, he was saying he didn't know whether he was going to retire. Like there was that sort of thing going around that he told Federer, that Federer said that he'd spoke to him a couple of weeks before, and he said he didn't know whether he played his last tennis match. And then he's going to win it. They made the final, ended up winning the final.
Yeah.
So I think he is, I actually think he's been pretty honest, and I think a lot of these athletes sometimes can put a brave face on and try and talk up their chances. But I think Nadal, over the last couple of years, has been straight up with us in terms of his fitness, and he's always said, "I don't know whether I'm going to be able to make it," and that kind of thing.
I think also the issues he's been dealing with, like he gets a lot. I mean, Twitter is a really bad microscope through which to view tennis, but. He gets a lot of abuse on Twitter for saying, oh, I'm injured, and then going out and playing 5 sets, and as though he's lying about his injuries and this, that and the other. And I actually think the types of injuries he's been dealing with, he often hasn't known. Like this foot thing is so weird, and he's now functioning in such a weird way because he's had this nerve basically burnt, that he probably doesn't know. And I don't think it's reasonable to assume that he's lying about his physical state. But nevertheless, to come back as rusty as he did in those 2 matches against... Okay, Fritz and Auger-Aliassime, in fairness, have been really good form at the end of the season, and that's a bit of a nightmare for someone, a guy in his mid-30s who's just had a kid coming back off a pretty slow autumn. But nevertheless, it's worrying results, I think, Callum.
Yeah, I guess when you say that, though, the thing is he's not always been particularly transparent about his injuries in the majority of his career.
Yeah.
Like he's always been pretty what have you been out with 6 months for, Rafa? It's leg injury and things like that, or arm. Just in terms of what's been injured, arm and things like that. So he's always been very, very secretive about any injuries. And so now that's why I find it quite refreshing that he has been quite straight up and always never given any details in his career as to when he'll be back. He's just come back, and as I've alluded to many times on the pod, he's the only player in any sport ever that just comes back and just starts winning things from being out for 4 months injured.
I mean, your comment earlier, James, around the kind of responses you were getting to Djokovic winning this sort of event. I mean, for me now, I'm looking at Nadal on a hard court and I'm thinking we're getting to the stage where I still think it's a fairly poor result actually for kind of wannabe top players now to be losing to him. And I felt that at the Australian Open. I was pretty vocal about that. That was a pretty poor result from Medvedev in my perspective. He totally had that match in his hand and kind of collapsed. I don't think many people will kind of dispute that, but you know, it mildly encourages me to see Auger-Aliassime and Fritz come out there and beat him comfortably on an indoor hard court. You know, they should be. They've got good serves. They have big all-action games, and this guy's kind of out of form. And I still think he'll be a threat on the clay, and we'll aim to kind of peak for that. And we'll have to see what happens in the off-season. But I think we're getting to that stage where I want to be going into matches on hard courts thinking, yeah, Alcaraz is going to kill Nadal here, or Medvedev is going to beat Nadal. Zverev, if fit, should beat him. Even Tsitsipas, I know Tsitsipas maybe isn't there, but that's someone as well you want to feel should be able to beat Nadal at this stage. So I'd like to be in a mental stage where I think Nadal's kind of 8th favourite to win the Australian Open in terms of this generation, and it probably speaks volumes that I still think he's 4th.
Sorry, I'm getting slightly distracted because I just thought Gareth Bale was going to score from about 55 yards, but that's not happened. It's the 10th minute of stoppage time as well, which is just ridiculous because the England game had 24 minutes of stoppage time. They're
dragging football games as long as tennis matches at this tournament.
I was going to say, one of the great things about football is you're supposed to know when the match finishes, and it should have finished about 15 minutes ago, so I wouldn't be distracted by it. But
well, without wishing to get too much into football, one of my main gripes with football is not playing enough added time. So I'm more than happy about it.
Spot the Man United fan there, I suspect.
Well,
they've always had them.
It's like the one thing that Newcastle seem to have spent most money on is new watches for their referees.
Yes, quite. I want to talk about Casper Ruud as well because, again, it's something I put on Twitter and got lots of kind of response to, and it got me thinking. I wanted to kind of break down or maybe summarise the last 2 years or 2 seasons, I should say, of Casper Ruud's career. In that time, he's made 2 Grand Slam finals, got within 1 victory of making world number 1. He's been at least the quarterfinals of 8 different Masters events. He's won 8 titles. He's gone from 27 in the world to 3 in the world. And he's also made an ATP World Tour final, semi-final, and now a final. Now, George, you've written in the show notes that the final highlighted his limitations. I'd argue those statistics show that he is, however limited you think he might be the most consistent guy outside of the big guys.
Yeah, I think my comment about highlighting his limitations shows like what his problem is in terms of winning the top events. I mean, Novak was pretty ruthless in that second set of really exploiting that backhand. You know, Ruud's serve has come on leaps and bounds this year. It's a really, really fantastic shot now. His forehand's always been big. The backhand is not, but you know, when you've got a big serve and a big forehand, you can kind of get on top of points. But I genuinely think he's done so fantastically well over the last 18 months that he is going well and well above beyond what he should be able to do in a field of players who have far fewer limitations than him. And I think we have to give him some mental credit as much as anything. You know, we look at what's missing from some of the top guys. Like if you look at Tsitsipas compared to Ruud, there's no reason Stefanos Tsitsipas shouldn't be playing for world number 1 this year in terms of consistency. And given Novak hasn't been able to play so much, you know, this has been a year where someone like that should have had a chance to go to world number 1, but he hasn't. And Casper Ruud has just turned up, slugged it out. But I think, and I don't think any of us will disagree with this, I still just wouldn't back him in a big match against a big player because he will get found out against him because that backhand is a big weakness.
Yeah, Calvin, how limited do you think his game is?
I think it's not limited. It is limited, but I don't think that's the problem. The problem is a mate of mine who's also a journalist that isn't one of you two messaged me yesterday because I think he was writing an article on it or doing some live blogging on it maybe. and he asked me what I thought of the match, and I said that the problem Ruud has is that he's basically a Poundland version of Djokovic, in that their basic style of play is exactly the same, and Djokovic, there's not a single thing that Ruud does better than Djokovic or as good as Djokovic on any wing. So I think he probably is. Look, as we are now, I think he's overranked at 3. If I'm honest, I think I'd still have the best 4 players in the world when everyone's fit, as being Djokovic, Alcaraz, Medvedev, and Zverev.
Nadal, you'll be attracting some
it's
comments.
hard. No, listen, I'll put an asterisk next to Nadal because it's just fitness-wise, isn't it? If you tell me that Nadal's fully fit, then absolutely, he's probably still. You'd probably still have him as 3, and knock the other 2 down. And on that basis, let's include Nadal in that. Then fair enough. Let's assume he's going to be fit around the Australian Open and then for the rest of next year. I don't see which of those players he's ever beating in a match of any importance. I don't see how he's going to. If Zverev comes back to fitness, if Zverev comes back to the level that he was at the French Open this year and had been for the year up until then. Medvedev, although he's had a pretty bad year, I still think again he does everything that Ruud does, but better. Nadal, Alcaraz, Djokovic, I just don't see how. I don't think he'd ever beat any of them, and that's a problem he's got. But I think he's solid enough to clean up all the rest, unless they're playing their 9 out of 10 or better game.
I think this kind of touches on quite an existential point of the men's tennis landscape now. Is like, how open is it going to be? Because if it stays as open this year, when you bear in mind Djokovic has missed 2 slams, Medvedev's missed a large chunk of the season, Nadal's missed a large chunk of the season, Alcaraz has struggled with injury in the back end of the year. If all these guys, and bear in mind Djokovic and Nadal are winding down, are going to keep missing big chunks of the season, then Casper Ruud will be one of those guys who happily mops up and turns up and cleans up. The question is how much of the players kind of keep developing around him. I honestly think people like Jack Draper can pass Ruud in terms of the game he's got and potential of going higher in the game. I think Felix Auger-Aliassime should be a stronger player than Ruud in the long run. It's just this question of, is Casper Ruud going to hit the perfect time of his career where he's being uber consistent in the time where men's tennis is probably at its most volatile since that era just before Federer came on the scene.
The thing is, I think, and I have a theory on players who are ranked sort of 6 to 10 or 5 to 10 at any one time in tennis. They fall into one of 2 categories. They fall into the guys who will never lose to players they shouldn't, and they can't beat the guys who are in the top 4. Or they're the players who will occasionally lose to guys who are ranked 60 in the world, but on their day they can definitely beat any of the top players, anybody in the world. And Ruud's definitely in the former of those categories, I think. But if you look at any players who are in that, I'd say Tsitsipas is the opposite. Tsitsipas can beat anybody if he plays his best game, but he can also, as we've seen at the US Open, he can lose to anybody. Felix Auger-Aliassime, absolutely in the same category. Rublev is in the same category as Ruud, I'd say.
And, we do often criticise, in the WTA especially because of the nature of women's tennis, these players for not being consistent enough and not coming out and, winning those games consistently. So, by the same token, we probably should say, well, this is a job that someone has to do, and in order to get into the top 10, you've got to do it, and then that should ladder you up.
I think we had the conversation around the US Open, like who's more likely to win a slam, Casper Ruud or Ons Jabeur, and my answer at the time was Casper Ruud, just because I don't necessarily see such the dominating figure in men's tennis, as good as Alcaraz is, as Iga Swiatek. That's an absolute nightmare match. Ruud at the minute is kind of enjoying. I hate saying the luck of the draw, because you still have to beat who's in front of you, and the draw is the draw. There's nothing you can do about that. But I do think he'll keep. This guy's been to 2 Grand Slam finals. You can't say that's a bad achievement. I think Medvedev's only. How many has he been to? 2, 3 now. I think 3. That's still pretty good numbers from Ruud to be chalking that up. So Yeah, look, it's good to have a consistent guy going. Whether I think he'll actually win a slam or not, I certainly wouldn't be putting any great money on it. But if he keeps putting himself in positions, one of these times, one of these guys won't get there, because we've said it time and time again. But Djokovic particularly can't keep going forever. We hope, anyway.
I mean, I don't know how to respond to that random "we hope," George. But yes, sure. I'm going to throw something out there if I can just verify this stat, because it was sitting in my head and I'm pretty sure it's right. But do you know how many top 20 players Casper Ruud has beaten at Grand Slams lifetime?
Probably not that many. I'd probably say it's under 5. So about 3.
It's 2. He beat Hubert Hurkacz in the last 16 at Roland Garros this year, and he beat Matteo Berrettini in the quarterfinals of US Open this year. Which, I mean, I'm surprised at. I thought that might be the case, just glancing at his record, but it does kind of sum up what Calvin was saying, I think, that, he puts away the guys he's supposed to put away. And I'm not saying that he's not going to change and evolve, and, we talk about players moving up the ladder. He could, but it sort of sums up where he is right now.
Can I just say, by the way, he actually played some pretty good tennis in both his Grand Slam finals as well. I don't think it's like a mental issue with Casper Ruud where I'm thinking he can't win big matches because he can't get into the right mindset. I think his mindset's pretty good and generally. Oh,
well, hang on, no, the French Open final, absolutely not. Like he walked out in that final beaten. Like, I have no doubt about that.
No, I thought he played some good stuff in that where he took it to Nadal with his forward. I'm not saying he was perfect. He's still going to be some nerves, but I don't think it's just a mentality issue that's stopping him. I think it's a genuine tennis limitation that will stop him against the very best guys.
I think the problem he has in those tournaments is that the best players in the world are all of that type. He's not from a different era where, say you had a guy who was like, you don't get them anymore really, but say you had a guy who was like Pete Sampras or some sort of serve volleyer who was still at the top of the game, one of the top 3 or 4 players. You could see a world where they have a stinker and they don't make first serves and Ruud plays out of his skin where he can beat them. The problem is all the guys above him all kind of play the same way as him and they're just better at it. And so you don't see a way that he's going to take down Alcaraz or Djokovic or Medvedev or even Tsitsipas. Not Tsitsipas, Zverev or Nadal.
I do. Just to defend Ruud slightly, there is a bit of a risk. We're kind of saying this guy has no weapons and no quality at all. There were times, particularly in that first set, where he had Novak against the ropes. He does have a really big booming forehand and can get on top of people. And there was one moment, I can't actually remember if it was end of second set or start. I think it was end of first set, where Ruud thought he'd kind of served to get to 40-30. Novak couldn't get there and he challenged and it was just out, but he had such a long wait for a second serve and it just turned out to be quite a pivotal moment in that game where he got broken. There were kind of small margins in that matches and then Novak suddenly kind of picked up some confidence and started playing beyond himself. But Ruud does have quality. I don't think we should diminish that. It's just as Calvin says, if you put Ruud playing a 7 out of 10 match against anyone in the top 5, he's going to lose that 9.9 times out of 10. But I'd still think there is a potential growth where Ruud can get himself up to a 9 out of 10 against one of those guys and can win. And I saw bits of that. I know you guys are saying he didn't play that well against Nadal, but there were points in that match at the French Open where he did play really well. He dominated off that forehand, and actually the shots he was missing were, okay, you might say nerves, but the build up into those points wasn't putting me off thinking this guy can actually get on top of these guys in the future. So I think there's reason to be optimistic for Casper Ruud fans, even if it sounds like we're slightly writing him off forevermore.
When I mentioned this on Twitter, Calvin, someone said to me, he reminds me of Mats Wilander, and I was wholly unqualified to kind of answer whether that was true or not. I don't remember Mats Wilander, the player. You may just.
If he's talking about game style, yeah, Wilander was a consistent baseliner, but Ruud's nowhere near as good as Wilander was.
Yeah.
Wilander was world number one, and but I mean, he won't turn out to be. Wilander was world number one and multiple Grand Slam winner. Not in the same league. I'd say he's more. If you're looking for, in terms of style and similarity, he's probably somewhere between Michael Chang and Sergei Bruguera. If you're looking for a sort of late 80s, early 90s type of player, I still think he's most likely. His best surface is still clay. But Chang strangely won a slam when he was, I can't remember, 16 or 17. 17. But then, if you said then when somebody wins a slam at 17, you think this guy's going to win multiple, and he never won another. He made a couple of other finals, but wasn't competitive in them. So post-slam winning Chang, I would say, was the closest to Ruud.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you said Chang, it sounded like Ruud's already missed the boat in terms of his opportunities.
Yeah.
It's too late.
That was one of those freak ones that it happens in tennis where both Lendl and Edberg, serious match players and two players with balls of steel, absolutely choked and crumbled under pressure against Michael Chang. So just a freak tournament, really.
Sounds like a tournament we might have to do a special on one day.
Sports Social, now on the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello, I'm Ashley Blaker, and I'm hosting a new season of the comedy panel show Never Write Off the Germans in partnership with my diesel claim. Join me and my esteemed comedy guests as we discuss all that's ridiculous with the greatest show on earth this winter in a host nation with domestic football equivalent to the Isthmian League South. We'll guide you through the tournament, covering everything that's funny with the countries taking part, whether you're a die-hard fan or an occasional bandwagon jumper just supporting your home nation until they're embarrassingly knocked out by Iran. Listen on the Sports Social Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts, but remember, never write off the Germans.
Now I want to move on because we have to talk about the Tsitsipas Rublev row, which might be my favourite thing from the week. I appreciate there was lots of great tennis played, but
We're all about the tennis.
Yeah, I mean, forget the tennis. Who cares? Stefanos Tsitsipas and Andrey Rublev dueling it out in Turin in the group stages. Rublev came from a set down to win 3-6, 6-3, 6-2, which knocked Tsitsipas out because it was his second defeat of the week. Now, needless to say, Stefanos Tsitsipas wasn't very impressed with himself. I'm going to read you what he said. This is the best way to do it, really. I didn't really feel threatened. I just wanted to try something new, see if it might work in the third set, throw him off a little bit. I had a long game towards the end where I kept trying new things. I can say things were coming off the racket pretty good from his side. It's a shame. I feel like the better player. I felt I could do more with the ball today. I felt I could just be much more creative. I don't even have to say that. I think it's quite obvious. But yeah, he prevailed with the few tools that he has. He was able to really take advantage of them and win today. This was put to Andrey Rublev in his press conference, albeit it took about 8 goes because he couldn't really understand what the questioner was saying. The moderator had to get involved and sort of explain what he said. And Rublev eventually worked it out and says, I don't know if I have few tools or not. If we go shot by shot, I think his backhand is better than mine. His forehand is not better than mine. The speed serve is not better than mine. He's faster. He plays much better than it. If we go for the best shot, I don't think... Obviously, he's a better player because he's higher ranked. He's achieved better results, it's obvious, no doubt. But I don't think that I beat him because of few tools. If you take our match, every match with tough battles. We always have tough matches. Only one final in Monte Carlo that he played with Roland, destroying me quite easily, but the rest were always tough matches. Calvin, I feel like Stefanos Tsitsipas and you are singing from the same hymn sheet for the first time in history.
In what way?
Well, in that Stefanos Tsitsipas says Andrey Rublev has very few tools available to him, and
you don't come out saying it. I mean, I think on the evidence of the last couple of days, I think Andrey Rublev probably makes better music than Stefanos Tsitsipas. Having never heard any music that Andrey Rublev has ever made, but I can't be much worse. I thought it was pathetic from Tsitsipas. Really, really pathetic. And I thought Rublev's response was bang on. He was absolutely miffed by it at the start, didn't understand what... I think it wasn't even the English that he didn't understand. I think he thought he was mishearing it. Like, how can somebody be talking such utter tongue after a match? But it was just not... I mean, it was just so childish. It was like the sort of thing that you get, like, tennis parents saying at under-12s tournaments, like, oh, but my son would have beat him. He was just hacking. He was just putting the ball up. You know, I thought the next comment from Tsitsipas was going to be, but a lot of the games went to juice. It was just absolute no. I'm joking about it, but it really was pathetic from a top class athlete. And it continues this theme of Tsitsipas just coming across like a really spoiled child all the time. Like he has no level of emotional intelligence or any level of maturity even. And what I'd say on Rublev, if we're going to sort of mildly take it seriously, which I don't agree that we should, he won the tennis match. There's that, that's just nonsense, is that it doesn't matter what Andrey Rublev had the tools to beat Stefanos Tsitsipas on the day when they played. And they're the only tools that you need to bring. Like if you're looking to, if somebody hires a painter and decorator, you don't have a go at them because they don't bring their car mechanic tools. You do what's needed. You bring the tools what's needed on the day, don't you? Like why he's winning the match? Why would he start serve volleying and drop shotting? Like in tennis terms, you just wouldn't need to, would you? Why would he start hitting some slices and some? Why would he start doing anything different? He's winning the match.
I was, when I saw these comments, I was starting to do a kind of a shot by shot breakdown of them and kind of take it one by one. I mean, I probably have Rublev's backhand above Tsitsipas, and that's possibly it. Is that a fair assessment? Like stroke by stroke?
But against what though? It's like what.
In terms of the optimal amount the shot has, I suppose. Like, I'm not saying. I know obviously there's the context of winning a tennis match doesn't matter, but I'm just saying in terms of broad stroke, like the power generated, the quality, the consistency of the shot. I'd probably I always say you should judge a player on their bottom and mid levels rather than their top levels. Well, that's true.
So if we want to get into, if you want to get into who has the best shots, then Juan Martín del Potro is the best player of the last 20 years. It's like, if that's what you want to do, you catch Juan Martín del Potro coming off against Novak Djokovic and going, he beat me with the few tools he had, and he'd be right to say it, wouldn't he? Like, he didn't catch. Listen, right? Nobody has ever brought more tools, in inverted commas, to the table than Roger Federer. Like nobody, and you'd never catch Roger Federer coming off losing to Andy Murray or Nadal. Look how many matches has Roger Federer lost to Rafa Nadal, where all Rafa Nadal's done for the entire match is whip up cross-court forehands to his backhand. And that's all he's done. And he's served every single serve to his backhand. And he's hit every single forehand to his backhand. And how many times have you heard Roger Federer come off and go, well, he beat me with the few tools that he had, and then go and make a shit fucking elevator music song at the end of it?
Just to defend Nadal, his forehand is a pretty good tool, to be fair. I wouldn't.
Andrey Rublev's backhand is. It's really wound me up when I heard it. Like,
we can't tell.
Did. Like, really did. I thought it was really. Listen. On a serious note, right? If I coached him, I would be absolutely furious with that. I'd be absolutely furious because he's taken no responsibility for his own tennis at all. And I'm not saying he should have come out and given a generic. He played. Andre played really well, and full credit to him. But come out and say I was just crap. I've got to come out and say, look, what he should have said. He come out and go, I've got to win those matches. I've got to be winning those matches. Like I've got the game. I'm losing me as Stefanos Tsitsipas, I'm losing too many matches like that. And if I want to be world number one, if I want to be a multiple Grand Slam champion, I've got to be winning matches like that. You don't come off and go, he beat me with the few tools he had.
And you sort of alluded to this earlier, Calvin, but there's a bit of a culture of excuses starting with Tsitsipas, isn't there? I mean, really, there has been over the last 18 months where, as you say, he's losing a lot of matches and always coming out and finding something to blame it on, and it's rarely just him being like, I wasn't good enough today. And I think this is another part of the frustration of Tsitsipas in the growth of his game, that mentally the growth, I think, has gone quite significantly far backwards from when you think of that moment where he, and I know sometimes we can get a bit stuck on those kind of big Grand Slam wins, but when you think of that kind of mentally huge win at the Australian Open where he came from 2 sets down against Nadal, you thought this was going to be a guy who was mentally always there. And at that time of the year, he was playing brilliantly. And, since that defeat to Djokovic at the French Open, just to find another signpost, it's felt like he's collapsed a little bit mentally to me. And that's shown in a lot of these press conferences that I think he's struggling to grow up, and in many ways it's kind of regressing. So it hasn't wound me up quite as much as Calvin, because I love a good kind of post-match press conference row. So I'm always supportive of someone going after their opponent, even if it is in the most petty way possible. But I think, Calvin's right in terms of where he wants to be and should be and could be. It's another kind of disappointing look over there rather than look at the problems in here.
If we were to talk about, George, as you mentioned, the different shot-for-shot comparison, we would definitely have to talk about mentality on the court. And I think that would be quite a close-run thing, because it's probably both of their greatest weaknesses, quite frankly. Sorry.
I mean, I've seen Rublev break his own hand quite a few times just punching his strings. The guy can totally lose it. But the mentality is a tough one between them. I've seen them both be really good mentally, where they kind of stick with it, play big matches quite well. I've seen them both be utterly awful, so I wouldn't want to call the lines in that one.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is, just to kind of move us on a little bit and talk a bit about Andrey Rublev, the player. He's obviously someone I think he's worked really hard on trying to be a bit kinder to himself on the court. And he put on his Instagram after the ATP Finals, he said, "Torino, thank you so much for all your love and support during the week that I didn't deserve. What I felt this week with your kindness and support shows me that I can be a better person and a better player. It means more than a world to me. Thank you." Now, I usually ignore what players post on Instagram after matches because it's usually incredibly tedious, but I thought that was actually quite open and vulnerable and a little bit honest. And Calvin, I kind of wanted to ask you, actually, I'm sure you've worked with players who are incredibly mean to themselves on court and effing and blinding and the rest of it. I mean, presumably it's something that as a coach you look at and go, we probably need to try and tone this down a bit because it's actually not very helpful emotion.
Would you like to know the funniest story of that kind of instance?
Of course.
So I used to coach a lad who he was very good. He was number one in the country at 12s or 14s, I can't remember. But he had a temper on him, like an absolute furious temper. So he once played a match at, and this is slightly, I wouldn't say X-rated, but it's close to the bone, this one. But, this is what this podcast does. He once played a match in Preston where I took to watch him. And at Preston, I don't know if any of our listeners have played at Preston South Ribble Tennis Centre. It's behind soundproof glass. You can watch the whole match, but it's soundproof, so you can't actually hear anything. So he played a match and he won the first set pretty comfortably. And then it was about 4-all in the second set, and he missed the shot. And I could see he was going nuts, but couldn't hear what he was saying, couldn't hear what had happened. He then proceeded to lose the next 8 points in a row and lost the set from that. And I thought, we're in a world of trouble here. And then he lost the first 2 points of the tiebreak. It was the first 10 tiebreak. So he was 2 down in tiebreak. He then went and won the next 10 and won the match. And I asked him, he came off, and I said, what happened there? You lost like 8-10 points in a row. And he goes, yeah, when I lost the first one, I accidentally rammed my racket into my privates, and I couldn't play for the next 5 minutes. So I guess then it stopped hurting at 2 love down in the break. So yeah, where I'm getting to is that players do strange things. I think. And yeah, it can be a lot. And I always say the same to players, though, in that kind of instance, is that you've got to have balance in it. without sounding like Mr. Miyagi, you've got to have balance in, like, if you want to criticize yourself, you've got to give yourself the credit for the good stuff as well. And that's what you find a lot of players don't do. They'll constantly focus on the bad stuff, and you're only getting that feedback from that. I will say this on Andrey Rublev. I find him quite an interesting character in what I'm seeing in the last year or so. Because I've been around him for a few years. I don't know him at all, but just through juniors. I've coached a couple of juniors who were similar age to him, so I've seen him around tournaments, and he wasn't the most pleasant. Let's put it that way. But at the same time, I also think, and I don't mean this as any real insult to him, I don't think he's ever been the most clever either. I think he's sort of quite institutionalized, and he was brought up in sort of quite a Russian way. And I know some people who've said to me before, and this was 5 or 6 years ago, that he'd said some pretty poor things. I don't want to go into it too much because I didn't hear them, but some pretty bad things. But what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is that he is actually trying to right himself, I think, from that. And I think some of the comments he's made and some of the things he said, and I don't think it's for show. He always comes across as pretty genuine. So I think he might have known that, earlier on in the year when he I don't know whether he was talking about the Ukraine stuff or not, but he was quite open about it, and I believed it, where he said, look, I just don't know enough about it, and I don't want to comment on it. And I thought, where some people say, use the old, I'm not a politician, I'm not getting into it, the way that he said it was that I just don't think he was almost admitting, I've not been educated enough on this, and I need to find out. And I think from what I've seen, he has found out, and from what I hear, he's trying to make himself a better person, like he said. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, because it's all very well saying, and to bring us briefly back to football, I remember Wayne Hennessy getting caught out doing some silly hand gestures on camera and saying he didn't know anything about the Holocaust and he was desperate to learn about it. I don't know whether anyone has bothered to check in with Wayne Hennessy and see how his postgraduate diploma in Second World War history is going, but I may be giving him not enough credit, but I suspect very little has gone on. Whereas, as you say, Calvin, yes, Rublev gave that I don't know enough about it answer, and at the time, I imagine, even if I didn't say it on here, I probably went, oh yeah, right. And as you say, he came out and he was very publicly anti-war last week, which for a Russian lad is just outrageously brave. George.
Yeah, I think in things like that, that we jump, and I think that, like I said, don't really want to get into what I'd heard that he'd said, but I think it was very much like, it's almost like you don't really give him a free pass on it, but he'd been brought up, like I said, in a very, very Russian background and that kind of thing, and it's almost like not a decision he'd made. Yeah. It's like, this is the way that people around him will talk, and this is the opinions that he will have told. This is what you have. And since he's been out in the world a bit more and obviously seen what's happened in the last year, I think he's probably started to question that and think, wait a minute, was everything that I've been told right? I guess the old Mitchell and Webb sketch, isn't it? Are we the baddies?
George, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, just to kind of suggest Rublev might be more intelligent than we think it is. If there was anything that was going to wind Tsitsipas up more than anything after that match, was how disastrously he then went on to play against Ruud. I think that really would have pissed Tsitsipas off watching that. Afterwards, like, what are you doing?
I think what would piss what would piss Tsitsipas off more is that Tsitsipas, with his COD philosophy and intelligence, like that, Andrey Rublev comes across as a much more intellectually advanced person than Stefanos Tsitsipas does now. He's like, he speaks, he's compelling when he speaks. He's not making a desperate effort. I think he said, I do think whenever I hear him talk, Rublev, I sort of quite like hearing him talk. When he's quite funny earlier at the US Open, wasn't it, where he said that he's like, I don't know how all the other players in the dressing room get all these tickets to go and see things, because every time I ask, they tell me there's none available. And then I see Stefanos Tsitsipas and Alex Zverev sitting front row at the Miami Heat.
That was actually very funny. Someone, because he is really into music. I mean, you would hate his music taste, Calvin.
I'm aware of it.
Yeah, he was
but
trying to get.
He's developed intellectually. Let's not write him off yet.
Yeah.
You maybe
send him a few playlists if you want.
Yeah, I mean, you said you hadn't heard the music he has made. He did make music when he was a younger lad, and I think it's close between him and Stefanos. But anyway, I'll put the link.
Who do we think? Who's the worst musician on the tennis tour? Is it Tsitsipas or Shapovalov?
I'm going to bat for Tsitsipas here in the sense that I found his music less offensive. Like, it was kind of just lift music and very little to do with Tsitsipas, whereas I think Shapovalov's
a rapper, right?
I don't know which is worse. But I think I don't know which is worse, but Tsitsipas I thought was terrible, and Shapovalov's was hilariously terrible. So I don't know which one I would say is worse.
Yeah, I just think if you're going to rap and you're someone in the public eye, you've got very limited the margin for error. It's a real low percentage shot going into the rap business.
And the wisest thing Tsitsipas did was have very little involvement in actually putting himself into the music. I think if he suddenly started singing or rapping or something, that is when it's really a disaster. So I thought that was a sign of musical intelligence to keep himself right out of the way. Well,
also, we must be behind the curve on this because on his YouTube channel it says this song was released in January, and this is the first I've heard of it. And the video only had 960 views when I found it on YouTube. And I can't quite believe that maybe it was on private until now. I'm not sure.
You sound quite shocked it didn't rush to the top of the charts or something.
Well, I just thought the memes alone, and I feel like Stefanos has probably got... I don't know. It's all a bit weird. Maybe it's not even him. Who knows? Maybe it's a different Stefanos.
The bloke called Stefanos Tsitsipas. Yeah, it could totally be possible. I really haven't bothered checking. I just assumed it would be.
Yeah, I've not texted
it seems like something that Stefanos would put together.
Yeah, I mean...
It's weird enough.
I hate to play the no smoke without fire card. 3,000 years of the British justice system comes down to this. But... No, it's not good. I'll put the link in the show notes. You can make your own mind up. I'll also put a link to Andrey Rublev's teenage boy band, which is pretty bad. I've got a question from a listener, a Colin Neem, who's a regular listener. He dropped me a message on Instagram, and it is a question for Calvin, as it almost always is. The ones for me and George are much more sort of four-letter wordy and rarely really questions, more statements. So good to get an actual question. Colin says, given that most doubles players at the upper end of the tour will have their own individual coaches, does this create conflict when it comes to deciding tactics for the team? Calvin, you're with a very successful doubles pair at the moment. I know Julian has his own coach, Barry. So how does that kind of work when you're preparing for a match or even when you're deciding wider things?
Baz coaches Julian and I coach Henry, so we wouldn't necessarily get involved on anything technical with each player. I wouldn't with Julian for sure, because Baz has coached him since he was a kid, and he's done an excellent job there, and they have a very special relationship. We both, in terms of tactics, we both work on the Louis Caillé double system, so there's no crossover there. We're both fully aligned with how doubles is played. So in that respect, between me and Baz, it doesn't have any, doesn't cause any ructions whatsoever. In terms of other coaches, I'm not aware that it ever has. It's not the coaches. I know that, for example, Luke's partner this week, who's the other doubles player I coach, Luke's partner wasn't keen on playing the doubles system. So that, I wouldn't say caused ructions, it's caused sort of some confusion, and, he didn't agree with it for one reason or another and wanted to play his own plays and that kind of thing. So it's more the players, I would think. I don't think the coaches would ever get involved with it, because there isn't really an alternative system either, and it would kind of be, if you scouted opponents and saw what you wanted to do, most coaches would see the same thing. So I wouldn't say ever that that there's any ructions in terms of tactics. I am always amazed that not many pairs have the same coach. It tends to always be individuals. I always wondered, like, wouldn't it be sort of financially more viable to have a coach? But then again, because of the way, as I alluded to last week, in terms of like how, unless you're in the top 20 in the world, it's difficult to keep a partnership together as well.
Yeah, it'd be pretty awkward when they split as well, because even at the top, they do split and swap quite often, don't they? And then it'd be a bit of a like kind of divorce.
Yeah, well, my friend Craig Veal, who James has interviewed, he coached a pair and then they split, and he ended up sticking with one of them.
Yeah, it must make things hard. So I suppose it makes sense to be. And also, I suppose, I mean, look, it doesn't happen necessarily, but you're on tour together, the four of you. There's going to be weeks when, player A doesn't really want to see his partner's coach because he's just like, I can't cope with that guy this week. Or like, I imagine them, you need to spend time apart, right? You don't spend every waking minute together. And your coach, Calvin, you may disagree here, but I always think that the best coaches are also quite good mates on tour.
That varies. You get coaches who don't socialise with players, and then you get players who, you get coaches who do. And it can often vary from player to player. Some coaches will spend more time, with other players than they do with other players. I mean, I have known there was a world number one pair who had the same coach, who was somebody who I know as a mate of mine, and the two players didn't get on at all with each other. They just happened to be very good at doubles together, and he said that was a nightmare in terms of that, because they basically they got to a stage where they didn't even practice together either. And I think it was at the US Open, one of them, because the scheduling at slams is always a bit weird. Like in the US Open, I think you can play on the first day and then not play until the Thursday. One of the players flew up to Boston to be as far away from his partner as he could be and just practiced on his own up there.
Very good.
So yeah, but then you get other players. Like you get pairs who stick together for their entire career, like Cabal and Farah, the Colombians. Have only played together, and I think they probably will only ever play together.
Yeah.
So,
it varies clearly. Let's move on to one final thing that I wanted to talk about, which I think Georgie raised this week, and I had actually come across it already at that point. And I will put a link to this in the show notes because it's definitely worth reading. And I know that we won't be able to do it justice in just what we talk about, and it's also quite long, and there's a lot of different moving parts to it. But Hannah Jane Parkinson, who's a writer, wrote, well, I don't use the word brave a lot because some things aren't brave, but this was spectacularly brave to write this incredibly long piece entitled Game Set Bankrupt, How an Addiction to Gambling on Tennis Lost Me £40,000. And she talked about how basically during lockdown her mental health got worse and she became a gambling addict, and using lots of the classic things that you hear about people who get addicted to gambling. It was just a little bit to begin with. Other bits of her life had fallen apart a little bit, and gambling offered her, a bit of a sense of community, a sense of something to do when there wasn't a lot to do as well. And she says, by the end, my entire existence revolved around it. She was trying to self-exclude from various websites, but found herself lying to her family to use their debit cards or credit cards, although she says she was still transferring the money, so she was at least gambling her money, but she was finding ways around the systems that stop you doing it. And she is now in recovery, thankfully, and clearly writing this was a really big part of it. George, give me some of your reactions to reading it, because I mean it's pretty startling, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a broad reaction to kind of the gambling industry as a whole, and then there's the kind of more tennis specific focus. I mean, I will approach it with honesty. I like putting the odd bet on. I'm someone who puts £1 or £2 on, and I've never really been consumed by it, but I find it can make the odd kind of football match particularly interesting if I have no little interest. So, I've never been someone who necessarily advocates the banning of gambling as a whole. I'm not anti-gambling per se. I do it myself. What I am anti, and she touches on kind of in the broad industry, there's parts where she kind of is able to justify to betting companies how, say she's earning more than she is and not setting limits. And I know she referenced a few kind of high-profile legal cases around a nurse, for example, who I think she says was able to had a betting limit of 1,300 a month and was earning 1,400 a month. There has to be tied to regulation within gambling. I don't want to get into kind of nanny state mode where we say you should be able to do this, this, and this, but it's important we do protect people. And she speaks very kind of honestly and openly around kind of the most vulnerable people in society, and brought out some great statistics on people with bipolar, for example, and they're kind of how likely they are to fall into that. The other side that I think is probably more relevant to our podcast, and is something I do feel very strongly about, is sports themselves taking responsibility for gambling. And there's some really interesting lines. She said one of them around tennis, where she said one of the few things that's got me through this is laughing about how much it was tennis that I was betting on, because it sounds so ridiculous. But the other bit, which really is the big problem for tennis, is that she goes quite in depth into how many different things you can bet on in tennis. And this is something that the tennis governing bodies did move to start changing a small while ago. And it's unfortunately been undone, as is always the case, unfortunately, in a lot of these sports, by money. There were big deals. I think it was ITF and Sport Radar signed quite a big deal that kind of undid some what had been kind of previously half-decent legislation. I'm fairly sure some of the tours have signed fairly poor deals, should we say. And, I'm not singling out tennis because other sports and governing bodies do this, but I think tennis has a bit of a responsibility in itself to actually close off some of these windows and work closely with gambling agencies or whatever to stop it. As she says, she was just betting 500 quid on the next point time and time again. That's a really, really dangerous cycle. I've never been on board with that. I think I personally have always been a bit of the case, in-game betting to a degree is okay, but there has to be a fairly strict cap fairly early on. And I'd much, in an ideal world, I'd probably say pre-match betting is where you have to stick. And then the other side is that I thought was quite interesting as well, was how she spoke about how she was betting on certain players who are going through certain things through their lives. And, there's this kind of gambler's idea where you're feeling in control, and then, not realizing Nicholas Kicker had kind of, was struggling to support his son and, took money off people because he was struggling to make ends meet. And this speaks to the wider point about the tennis ecosystem. Tennis is so rife for corruption at the lower ends of the game because they're not paying people enough, because it's not a kind of a solid enough sport in any way, and there's a poor ecosystem that it opens itself up to this. So, tennis's answer to stopping those kind of challenges about not paying people enough was to really restrict the gambling before and kind of tackle it on that side, and they've pulled back away from that. And I think that's really poor, and this article shone a light on that, which I think is a very positive thing in an otherwise fairly negative subject, and one that doesn't reflect on tennis very well.
Yeah, not a lot to disagree with there, George. Calvin, I wanted to ask you about it because, in the parts of the tour that you work in are often loss-making ventures, and if they're not, then they're often propped up by or underwritten by bookies. It's a part of the tour which, to an extent, exists because of gambling. Is that fair to say? Does that give you a different perspective on things?
Yeah, it's prevalent. I haven't seen any in the last year or so, but you used to get these people hanging around tennis tournaments, at futures tournaments, basically betting on points before, because it takes 3 seconds to go through the umpires. The whole betting system, in-play betting system, works on the umpire's handheld computer, where they put the score in, and then it goes through, and you get these people who are watching, climbing trees near the tennis clubs and betting on it just to get the bet in 3 seconds before it actually gets in play, and that kind of thing. So you see them. There's still a major problem with gamblers, and I guess it's kids really, just foully abusing players. Both of my players have had some horrendous messages this year from that kind of thing. And it's just, that's just sort of pathetic. And as George alludes to, it's like I've never, you can't justify match fixing at all through betting, and that's where what the root of it is. But pay your players properly. If that's at least a limit. I'm not saying, there's a solid argument that it's human nature, people will be greedy and people will do it anyway. And I can completely see that. But pay your players properly. It's like you can't, the flights, for example, there's some guys going to be getting to Australia now if you've squeezed in the tournament and say or if you're going for qualies, you're 250 in the world. The flights to Australia at the minute are £2,500. That's, and look at what the prize money is. It's like you got to pay your play. If you want them to travel, you want them to pay. You got to pay your players. I keep saying it all the time. You can't just have 120 players making money from a sport that claims to be one of the elite sports, a truly international sport. Look at any other sport like that. How many? What the 400th best footballer in the world will be a millionaire. The 400th best basketball player will be a millionaire. 400th best tennis player isn't breaking even.
And that, we've touched on this in previous weeks. Every single aspect of tennis you look at where there is problems ultimately comes back to this massive ecosystem problem and the structural problems in the game. And I think unless you tackle it holistically, really kind of taking every issue, whether it be gambling, whether it be environmental, whether it just generally being players breaking even or not, whether it being rest, there are so many big issues that really require some serious people coming together at the top of the game. How many times we heard over the years, it'd be lovely if the 7 pillars of tennis, ITF, slams, tours, all came together and started working together. There are serious problems that require those people to actually take a look at the game as a whole and deliver serious change. And unfortunately, that's not come close to happening for a long time.
Yeah, loads to talk about there, and we definitely could do lots more on gambling, and maybe during the off-season we'll get a chance to talk about more in depth in gambling in tennis. Do read the article, it's in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Please do leave us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And most importantly, do come back next week.
Sports Social Podcast Network.